There was a time when Jon Jones was viewed as a fighter destined to become the mixed martial arts equivalent of Michael Jordan, a possibly once in the history of the sport athlete with nearly limitless potential and enough time to set records that would never be broken. But when Jon Jones is discussed by MMA fans and commentators today, the conversation is as much about his many faults and failings as it is about his greatness. As a fighter, he has reached the highest of highs, becoming the youngest champion in UFC history, with an almost unparalleled title reign. Yet at the same time, he has also reached unprecedented lows, being the only UFC fighter ever to be stripped of a title twice, while tarnishing his own legacy with a litany of controversies both in and out of the cage. In this series, we are going to explore the career of Jon Jones, and try to understand the decisions that led him to go from a man poised to be the greatest fighter of all time, to a largely maligned figure in the world of MMA. Chapter 1. The Ascent. There isn't much that can be said about the rise of Jon Jones that hasn't already been said countless times in every article, TV broadcast, or social media post about him. It's like Arthurian legend at this point, a tale woven into the fabric of the modern era of the sport that most fans know by heart. After a successful amateur wrestling career at the high school and JUCO level, Jon dropped out of college, where he was studying criminal justice of all things, to pursue a career in mixed martial arts. He made his debut in April of 2008, and by July he had already bulldozed 6 straight opponents. In hindsight, the results are pretty obvious, but what makes them all the more impressive was that Jones had yet to team up with the legendary coaches Greg Jackson and Mike Winkeljohn, who would shape his UFC legacy. Less than a month later, Jon was signed by the UFC as a short-notice replacement in a bout with Andre Gusmao at UFC 87. The fight was very clinch-heavy, and Jon's boxing looked understandably rudimentary. Despite this, he went on to win all 3 rounds against the 5-0 Gusmao by utilizing his now trademark mix of wrestling and unorthodox strikes, as well as something else that would become a trademark of Jones, scoring multiple fouls by kneeing Gusmao in the groin. After his impressive debut, Jon's potential was put to the test when he was matched up against UFC veteran Stephan Bonnar. At the time, Bonnar had only lost to Lyoto Machida, Forrest Griffin, and Rashad Evans, and many viewed this fight as the UFC throwing Jon into the deep end. If you've been watching the sport for a little while, I can almost guarantee that you've seen the highlights of this fight, specifically the suplex and the spinning back elbow that made Bonnar flare-flop to the canvas. That said, the fight was not as dominant as many people remember it being. Jon did land a wide variety of impressive throws and takedowns, but he had a hard time keeping Stephan down for very long. In the 3rd round, Bonnar picked up the pace against a fading Jones and outstruck him by a substantial margin, winning the round on at least 2 judges' scorecards. However, Jon won the first 2 rounds convincingly and got the victory over the gritty veteran. In his next fight, Jon was matched up against Irish Jake O'Brien, who he made easy work of, and from here we all know the story. Jon was given a fight against Matt Hamill as the main event of the Ultimate Fighter Heavyweights finale. A little over 4 minutes into the first round, he would end up on the wrong side of one of the most bizarre officiating decisions in MMA history. After Jon hit Hamill with a few technically illegal 12-6 elbows, certified toolbox Steve Mazzagatti paused the fight to deduct a point from Jon.
1 point, downward elbow. Now you want to know how ridiculous.
Then, after asking Matt Hamill, who is deaf by the way, if he was done, Mazzagatti decided to end the fight. No, not by TKO as the commentators believed. And no, not a no contest either, which would make sense since the real reason Hamill couldn't continue was because he had a dislocated shoulder, not the illegal elbows. To the confusion of everyone, including Jon Jones who had just cartwheeled around the cage in celebration, Bruce Buffer announced Hamill as the winner by disqualification. It was an unfortunate outcome that will live on forever through Joe Rogan explaining for the 300th time that the 12-6 elbow rule only exists because athletic commissions watch karate guys break concrete blocks with their elbows. Interestingly though, this odd decision actually went down in history as the first time that instant replay was used to determine the outcome of a fight in Nevada, something the Nevada State Athletic Commission had only made legal 4 months prior. Because of this, the NSAC would uphold Mazzagatti's decision, despite many attempts to have it changed to a no contest over the years.
Steve stopped the fight initially, take the point away, looked at him, couldn't continue, had to make an initial call, then came down to look at the instant replay. So this is actually the first time the instant replay was utilized in Nevada. Looked at it, obviously a lot of damage done by legal blows, but then there was damage also done by the illegal elbows. And obviously, as you know, if there's any contributory effect, of the illegal blows and disqualifications, the calls.
Following the Hamill fight, Jon would make up for this loss with back-to-back first-round stoppages of Brendan Vera and Vladimir Matyushenko. These victories led to a fight against Ultimate Fighter winner and fellow undefeated light heavyweight prospect, Ryan Bader. After taking the Division I All-American wrestler down early, Jones spent the majority of the first round dominating Bader on the ground. The second round was mostly a striking affair, until Ryan made the strange decision to attempt a guard pull with about a minute left in the round. Jones quickly lashed onto a guillotine choke that forced Bader to tap. In the post-fight interview, Joe Rogan told Jon that his training partner, Rashad Evans, had pulled out of his fight with then-champion Mauricio Shogun Rua due to a knee injury, and Jon will be replacing him. While this title run may not be as fast as some others like George St. Pierre or Anderson Silva, it's still worth putting into context. It took Jones less than 3 years to get a title shot in what was considered at the time to be the sport's marquee division. A weight class so competitive that the top light heavyweights of that era were passing the title back and forth like a game of hot potato. His opponent was no pushover either. This was the guy who beat Rampage, Little Nog, Overeem, and Arona to become the Pride Middleweight Grand Prix winner at only 23 years old, which is still considered one of the greatest accomplishments in MMA history. Rua had a hiccup against Forrest Griffin in his UFC debut, but by 2011 it looked like he had figured things out. He solved the puzzle of Lyoto Machida, only to have the judges turn in a decision so bad that the UFC made an immediate rematch. And in their second fight, Shogun made sure it didn't go to the judges by knocking the elusive karate stylist out cold. Jones had shown tremendous talent and potential, but certainly this was the fight that would put him to the test. No. Jones demolished Shogun in one of the most one-sided championship fights in UFC history. The numbers don't lie. Over the course of 2.5 rounds, Jon scored 3 takedowns and outlanded Rua in strikes 102-11, with most of these strikes coming by way of a brutal drubbing on the ground. Then, 2.5 minutes into the third round, Jones landed a body shot followed by a knee to the head that dropped Rua and forced him to tap to strikes. The win is one of the most pivotal moments in Jon's career, not just because he became the youngest UFC champion at the age of 23, or because it was the beginning of a string of wins over a murderer's row of former champions, but because this win would drive a wedge between him and his Jackson Winklejohn MMA training partner, Rashad Evans. Prior to Jon's fight with Rua, Evans told BJPenn.com that he would leave the team if Jones were to win. Following the events of UFC 128, Evans stayed true to his words by leaving Jackson Winklejohn MMA.
What do you think you're going to do? Will you train with Jackson's or stay at Grudge? Do you know?
I'm done with Jackson's.
You're done? How come?
I'm done.
You feel as though they betrayed you?
I'm done. I'm done with Jackson's.
After the split, Rashad settled in Boca Raton, Florida, where he joined a group of fighters that would later become known as the Black Zillions. From here, it didn't take long for a feud to start brewing between Evans and Jones. As with many other such cases, the rivalry between friends was far from straightforward. With Jon's win over Shogun, he and Rashad were scheduled to fight at UFC 133 in August of 2011. Unfortunately, in April of 2011, Jon was forced out of the fight, citing a lingering thumb injury from his college wrestling days. Instead of waiting for Jones to recover, Evans chose to fight Phil Davis at UFC 133. And this is where things get a bit weird. After Evans agreed to fight Davis, Jon announced that he was opting to heal his thumb through physical therapy instead of surgery, and was meeting with the UFC to book his next fight. With the revelation that Jon was not having surgery on his thumb, Rashad accused him on Twitter of lying about the injury. Quote, "Question, if you are or were so confident, then why fake a thumb injury? Because just between me and y'all, he don't need surgery. If I'm lying, I'm dying. Ask Johnny Bones. When is his surgery and who was his doctor? He's so fake, he fakes surgeries." End quote. Later that day, Jon fired back at Rashad, saying, quote, "Rashad, go ahead and try to play me now. Never have I seen a man so jealous and self-centered. I almost feel bad for you." End quote. In another twist, Phil Davis pulled out of UFC 133 and was replaced by Tito Ortiz, who was coming off a surprise submission of Ryan Bader. Tito was not able to pull off another upset, but was instead finished by Evans with a knee to the body and punches late in the second round. Ironically, during the fight, Rashad shattered his thumb on Tito's enormous head, requiring surgery of his own. For his part, Jon was scheduled to fight Quinton Rampage Jackson at UFC 135 in September. Despite already being in one feud with Evans, Jon ended up getting embroiled in another beef with Rampage in the lead up to their fight. Perhaps the most infamous moment in the pre-fight build-up was when Rampage accused Jones of spying on him. As he explained in an interview with Kevin Aioli of Yahoo Sports, Quentin suspected Jackson Wink MMA of having a spy in his camp dating back to his fight with Rashad Evans. Following the advice of a fan on Twitter, Rampage decided to orchestrate a sting operation by spreading a rumor amongst his teammates that he had sustained a hand injury. Within 4 hours of spreading this lie, Jackson's manager received a call from UFC matchmaker Joe Silva inquiring about the potential injury. Again, according to Rampage, Joe Silva said that he was inquiring because he himself had received a phone call from Jon Jones' manager, Malki Kawa. To quote Rampage, "How did he know about my hand injury that fast? It wasn't on the internet, and yet he knew about my hand injury right away. That shows me 2 things. They have spies in my camp, 1, and 2, they're dumb as hell, because they didn't know how to use the information correctly and to wait. He called right away, running to Joe Silva. Joe Silva called my manager right away." End quote. Shortly after the accusation was made, Jones responded with several tweets. Quote, "At Rampage for real, just so you know, I'm not a person who looks for shortcuts in life. Unlike you, MMA is not something I do because of money. It's a way of life for me, and I would never disrespect the integrity of that. I have way more faith in myself as well as respect for the art of fighting to ever stoop that low. That's just bad karma. Believe me or not, I've said my part. Hoping you have a safe and healthy finish to your camp. #respect. End quote. The following day, Jon's manager, Malki Kawa, denied the accusation in a long-winded statement to MMAJunkie.com. According to Kawa, he received a phone call from one of his employees who informed him that he had seen a tweet stating that he had heard of the possibility of Mr. Jackson suffering a hand injury and that it may be serious. Kawa further stated that this led him to believe that Mr. Jackson is simply looking for a way to create a distraction or create more pre-fight hype. Rampage responded to this by saying that not only was the rumor of his hand injury not on Twitter, but also that Kawa was dumb and full of shit. Perhaps the strangest event to come out of the Spygate controversy was the truly surreal interview Jones did with Luke Thomas, where he spoke in a British accent.
On a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being you didn't even notice it, 10 being you couldn't sleep at night, rate the level of distractions in this camp.
Well, I'm British, so being a double agent is what we do. So it wasn't a distraction, I just simply got caught.
Right.
Yeah.
You got caught spying.
Yeah, he caught me. It was a chef, and the chef kind of put me out there a little bit. I'm comfortable with it. Too late now.
All right. Okay.
I'll leave it up to you to decide whether or not you believe in the accusations of spying. At any rate, the animosity between Jones and Jackson grew as the date of the fight approached. According to Rampage, at least, the beef started not because of the spying, but because of comments Jones made at a pre-fight presser that Jackson found disrespectful. Specifically, Jon calling him movie star Rampage due to his role in the 18 movie the previous year.
There will always be excuses. I'm sure that there'll be.
Every day.
You didn't fight the Pride Rampage. You fought the,
No.
the movie star Rampage. So.
Jackson also accused Jones of being fake by acting humble and respectful in public, only to disrespect him in person.
You said on multiple occasions that you think he's fake, to be honest. What is it that you see that maybe we're not seeing or that other people aren't seeing that don't see the fakeness?
Well, I think a lot of people see it, you know what I'm saying, just because you don't see it. I didn't notice it at first because I don't pay attention to Jon, but I do pay attention to my followers on Twitter, and they tell me stuff, and then I started looking at them, and you can tell he put on his, you know what I'm saying, real good boy act in front of the camera and stuff like that, and everything, but then after a while, once he got this belt, his head got kind of big, and you know what I'm saying, you can tell, like, you know what I'm saying, he's been slipping a little bit here and there, and some stuff he's saying, and at the press conference and stuff, like when I noticed him, and I talked to him, he was saying some cocky stuff, which made me a little bit agitated and stuff, you know what I'm saying.
By voicing these frustrations, Rampage was establishing one of the longest-running criticisms of Jon's character, that being the belief that Jon's public persona was fake. But for all of Rampage's complaints and accusations, in the end he still lost. Not as bad as Shogun, but it was still one-sided. Jones put on a masterful performance in which he utilized an arsenal of kicks to dismantle Jackson's mobility before submitting him in the 4th round. However, the fight was not without criticism or controversy. For one, Jon repeatedly turned his back and literally ran out of range of Jackson's punches. This led some fans to accuse Jon of being scared and running away. There was also the issue of Jon's, let's say, fighting in the gray area of the unified rules of MMA. Of particular note was Jon's use of the oblique kick to the knees of Rampage. Even a decade later, the oblique kick is still hotly debated by fans, media, and fighters alike. The kicks were certainly effective, and left Jackson as a sitting duck for much of the fight. At least one oblique kick did clearly hyperextend Jackson's knee, and he was never the same fighter after this fight, whatever the reason. Rampage himself has claimed that the kicks used by Jon ruined his left knee. He's gone as far as to call Jon dishonorable for using them.
The fighters, these new fighters, they have no honor, like Jon Jones, poking people in the eye and kicking the knee back. Like, you're supposed to be a man of God and stuff like that. You can injure somebody, you can sever their career, you can mess people up for life kicking a knee back like that. Like, that's to me that has no honor. I take a lot of honor in fighting. He has no honor.
And still to this day, Rampage refers to Jon as a dirty fighter. Many fans walked away from this fight with the same impression, not only due to the leg kicks, but also Jon's egregious eye pokes. They're completely illegal and should merit a point deduction. However, referees rarely ever do this, even in the case of someone like Jon Jones, who has become as synonymous with poking people in the eyes as he is for sandblasting hookers and T-boning pregnant women.
Jones put his finger in his eye, the dirtiest fighter in MMA.
At any rate, this moment became a turning point in the way fans viewed Jones. Prior to his conflict with Rampage, Jon had presented himself as the consummate professional athlete who embodied the ideals of a martial artist both in and out of the cage. This was the man who helped stop a mugging hours before his fight with Shogun Rua.
The mugger thing, it was like I felt like I had an obligation as a warrior, as an athlete, as someone who was healthy and fit enough to protect someone else. My career had nothing to do with that. It was like, my fight was worth nothing compared to, getting justice for this woman at the time.
But between Spygate, Rampage calling him fake, and Jon's morally questionable fighting tactics, fans were starting to take a second look at Jones. Behind the scenes, was he the same person he portrayed himself to be in the media? Or was there something more going on? Chapter 2: Murderer's Row. Following the Rampage fight, rumors spread that Jones would be matched up against Evans at UFC 140 in December. That idea was shot down by Dana White, as Evans only just had the pins removed from his thumb and was still recovering. Rashad didn't let this prevent him from continuing his beef with Jones, though. Ironically, despite being injured himself, he stated his belief that Jon would fake another injury whenever their next bout was scheduled. With Rashad out of the picture, Jones was paired against another former lightweight champion in Lyoto Machida. Aside from the beef with Rashad, Jon managed to avoid much controversy during the lead-up to 140. In fact, the only real controversy came after the fight. The first round was actually competitive, with Machida even landing a punch that seemed to stun the champion. But round 2 was much different. After controlling much of the round, Jon landed one of his patented elbows that opened a huge cut on Machida's forehead. Machida managed to escape the horrible position he was in and got to his feet, only to have Big Jon call the doctor in to look at the cut. It was determined that Machida could continue, and the fight was restarted in their previous clinch position. Then, a little over 30 seconds later, Jones caught Machida with a counter left hook, which set up a brutal standing guillotine choke. Machida attempted to get free but was choked completely unconscious, was then unceremoniously dropped to the canvas, Machida's still open eyes gazing hauntingly into the void. It's what happened moments later that caused the controversy, though. As Machida was being tended to on the stool, Jon's coach, Greg Jackson, told him to, quote-unquote, go get some fans by checking on Lyoto.
Jon! Go check on him! Go check on him! Go check on Lyoto! Get some fans!
In general, I'm not too crazy about fighters checking on their opponents. It's somebody you just brutally finished, likely derailing their dreams in the process, so I have no problem with Jones dropping Lyoto and walking away. On the other hand, there is something so cynical and transparent about Greg Jackson telling Jon to go get some fans by checking on Machida. In isolation, it can be viewed as an ill-advised gesture, but it's one example of many behaviors and actions displayed by Jones which led to the growing perception that his public persona was manufactured. Regardless, the win over Machida would once again lead back to the rivalry with Rashad Evans. While it may seem tame in comparison to the utter blood feuds of today, there was a time when the rivalry between Jones and Evans was considered one of the most personal in the sport. For the most part, it was Rashad who did the talking. Specifically, Rashad aired his grievances with Greg Jackson, who he believed betrayed him by siding with Jon Jones.
Okay, so now Greg, you gonna go against me? You gonna go against me, right? You can go against George St. Pierre? Oh, okay. You gonna bring in Carlos Condit? He helped make you too. So where does your loyalty lie?
Rashad would eventually claim that this went all the way back to when Jones was brought into Team Jackson Winklejohn, despite Rashad being their main light heavyweight fighter.
On the other hand, you have Rashad, who's bashing the program, the history.
The history? I made that history. What are you talking about? I'm the one who helped make that history. You came into it. You came into it. Don't talk about the history when you have no roots in the history. Don't talk about, I helped make Greg Jackson. I helped to make him the reason why you even wanted to come there and train. So don't talk to me about the history of the team, bro.
Although Rashad's claims are only one side of the story, we've heard the same story from former Jackson Wink fighters like Diego Sanchez and Donald Cerrone. In all three cases, these men felt like Jackson tried to groom their replacements while they were still training at the gym. Although Greg Jackson and Mike Winklejohn denied Rashad's allegations, Jackson did admit to making a mistake with the way the situation was handled, and the fact that they had no contingency plan in place for a scenario of this nature. While Jackson initially intended to stay neutral in the fight between Jones and Evans, he eventually came to realize that it was his duty to the team to corner Jon against Rashad, citing the Civil War as the inspiration for his decision. The alleged betrayal was hardly the extent of the drama spawned from Jon and Rashad's time as teammates, though. One of the biggest narratives leading into this fight surrounded their sparring sessions at Jackson Wink.
But you do remember when I went with you and I held you down, and I slapped you and punched you all in the face, and I was beating you in practice, and you begged me, can you get up? And then I said, if you quit now, you will quit in the fight. So I made you work back up to your feet. You remember that? And he was like, yeah.
We trained together many times. I know what he's good at. I know what he's not good at. So I'm just going there and fight Jon like I would in practice and just let it all hang out. I know there's things that he's got better at, and I'm going to show him what I got better at.
You're talking about a day when you held me down for maybe 30 seconds and said, okay, Jon, work to get up. And I said, no, just let me up, bro. You didn't strike me.
No,
you didn't submit me. You held me down.
You were about to cry.
I was about to cry.
You were crying. He was like, get off me. Get off me. And then he gave like the 1, 2, 3, and he couldn't move. Like.
In addition to the conversations about their time training together, Rashad took a page out of Rampage Jackson's book and accused Jon of behaving differently behind closed doors.
I think things are going too far, but I want to be the first to tell you that I'm going to destroy you. I'm going to show that you're washed up in the sport. I'm going to show that I am the best light heavyweight ever, and I'm going to show what the new breed of fighting is, and you're going to be my first highlight knockout.
As the fight drew nearer, Evans increasingly attacked Jon for the fraudulent nature of his character, which led to a few pretty heated exchanges and an ominously prophetic statement from Evans.
You lose a fight, you will change the person who you are. You won't be the same person.
I won't.
Because you know why?
I won't.
Your fabric is fake.
My fabric is
You're
fake.
fake.
Tell me how my fake, Rashad.
I'm not gonna get into that right here, but
Okay.
you know I know.
Why am I
You can
fake?
sit up here and put on the holy, oh, Jon, I'm this and I believe in this and that, but I see you in life. I see you in life.
I do believe. What are you talking about? Me being a Christian? Am I not perfect,
the way you
Rashad?
live, the way you live.
Do I need to be perfect, Rashad, to be a Christian now?
No, you don't need to be perfect, but at least you can do this. Be who you say you are.
I am who I say I am.
You know, I think Jon is fake, and Jon is fake just by even sitting here and saying that he's not. This is not going to be personal. Of course, this is personal. He want to smash me as bad as I want to smash him.
And I just say what I say about him being fake because Jon is not the person that, you know, he says he is or tries to pretend he is to be. He's setting himself up for a fall that I don't think he can take right now.
When it was all said and done, Rashad's psychoanalysis of Jones had little effect on the outcome of the fight. His assessment that he knew what Jon was going to do because of their time spent training together also proved completely incorrect. It was another clinic by Jones who dominated all 5 rounds and landed more than twice as many strikes as Evans. Rashad did put up some fight and survived a few dangerous moments, but he simply wasn't prepared for the evolution of Jon's skill set. In this case, Jon's use of hand fighting and vicious step-in elbows. This was an adjustment that nobody saw coming, the least of all being Rashad, it seemed. It still stands as one of the most impressive and innovative uses of offensive elbows the sport has ever seen. With the end of the fight seemingly came the end of the beef. At the post-fight press conference, both fighters showed each other respect, as well as an optimistic view of a potential future reconciliation.
But it was a great fight, and I respect Rashad a lot and thank him for taking this fight.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome. You know, I still got a lot of thinking to do with the whole situation. One thing I do want to get out of this is to rekindle a respect level and some type of communication with Rashad, and hopefully we can do that in private and you know, work on that in the future. And there's a lot of emotion between us that could lead to a friendship. I mean, it's very easy to get along with and hang out with Rashad. So I think that's something that we both will hopefully look forward to in our private time in the future.
But, like Jon was saying, you never know what can happen in the future. And, we were friends before, so, you never know what would happen. And
from this point on, both fighters went in virtually opposite directions, career-wise. Jon would build and then tarnish a legacy as one of the greatest fighters of all time. For Rashad, he never looked the same way after the Jones fight. During the pre-fight build-up, Jones stated that he was going to end Rashad's career. Looking at the numbers, it's hard to argue that he didn't. Prior to fighting Jon, Rashad had only lost 1 of 18 fights in his career. Post-Jones, he went on to lose 6 of his last 8, with some of those fights coming against less than stellar opposition. The rivalry with Rashad Evans may not have been anywhere near as vicious or fiery as future clashes with fighters like Daniel Cormier, but it may be one of the most important moments in the career of Jon Jones. With the win over Evans, Jon had now beaten 4 former UFC champions in a row, in just shy of a calendar year. A run that is still considered by many to be one of, if not the greatest feats in MMA history. However, the rivalry had also established a narrative about Jon that persists to this day. Many people had come to believe that the image he presented to the media and the fans was fraudulent, and in the events leading up to his next fight, Jon wasn't about to do himself any favors in the court of public opinion. Chapter 3. Binghamton Drift. On the morning of May 19, 2012, Jon Jones was driving his recently acquired $250,000 2012 Bentley Continental through the streets of Binghamton, New York, when he crashed into a utility pole and was subsequently arrested by the Broome County Police Department on suspicion of DUI. After being bailed out later that day, Jones would take to Twitter and tweet the message, "God is good." Although the authorities initially refused to comment on specifics of the arrest, further details would come to light in the following days. Though Jones himself only suffered minor injuries, his 2 female passengers, which included a woman Jones had gone to high school with, suffered bruises and cuts significant enough to require hospitalization. It was reported by the arresting officer that Jones had slurred speech and glassy, bloodshot eyes, smelled of alcohol, and was unsteady on his feet when asked to step out of his vehicle. Jones also reportedly politely refused multiple requests to take sobriety and breathalyzer tests, both at the scene and after he was taken into custody. In the wake of the arrest, it was revealed that this was not Jon's first brush with danger behind the wheel. He had been involved in accidents in 2008, 2009, and 2011. During the incident on November 24th of 2011, Jon was pulled over in New Mexico when an officer witnessed him coming around a corner sideways with tires squealing before pulling into a strip club parking lot at a high rate of speed. Jones was driving with a suspended license at the time, which he was cited for alongside loss of traction. It should be noted that Jon was not found at fault for the 2008 or 2009 accidents. Additionally, both charges related to the strip club drifting incident were dropped during a criminal trial in March of 2012. Keep in mind, that also means that only 2 months after going to trial for a driving offense, Jon was getting arrested for a DUI. Even worse were comments Jon had made just a month before the accident in upstate New York. In the lead-up to UFC 145, Jon had set his sights on being sponsored by Nike. Part of his strategy at the time was to not make himself a billboard covered in multiple sponsors. So to keep his branding clean, Jon became sponsored by the UFC itself. As Jon explained, quote, "I'm glad the UFC wanted to work with me as well, and I think that they trust that I'll never make them look bad. You never have to worry about me with a DWI or doing something crazy." End quote. To add one more layer of irony to this story, Jones had actually taken part in a Bud Light ad campaign with the UFC, the commercial for which has ostensibly been scrubbed from the internet. Ultimately, the legal consequences for Jones' DUI were minor. In June of 2012, he was fined $1,000 and his license was suspended for 6 months. The consequences for his public image, however, were more significant. As we've discussed, there was a growing belief that the person Jon portrayed himself to be was not who he was behind the scenes. It began all the way back in the lead-up to UFC 128, when some people doubted the authenticity of Jon's involvement stopping a mugger before his fight with Shogun. Rampage Jackson, and to a greater extent Rashad Evans, fanned the flames of the narrative that Jones was fake, but the DUI was the first major piece of evidence people could actually put their finger on. This was also the first time Jon would take part in an act that would become a mainstay of his public persona in years to come, taking no responsibility for his actions and instead attributing them to the will of God. There were those willing to give Jon a pass because he was a young man dealing with the pressures of fame and fortune who was bound to make a few mistakes along the way. At the same time, Jon's behavior was starting to leave a bad taste in the mouth of an increasing number of MMA fans. With that in mind, the growing rift between Jon and the fans would not be his only worry for long. Chapter 4: Sport Killers. UFC 151 will be remembered as the event Jon Jones and Greg Jackson murdered. This is a direct quote from Dana White during the press release announcing the cancellation of UFC 151, the first time in the company's history that they were forced to cancel an entire event. But let's back up a little bit. Following the DUI incident, things were actually going pretty good for Jones. In early August, he made one of his dreams a reality when he became the first UFC fighter to sign a sponsorship deal with Nike. He was also booked to fight Dan Hendo Henderson at UFC 151. Henderson had recently returned from a 4-fight stint in Strikeforce, where he lost a decision to Jake Shields, then racked up 3 straight KOs over Seraldo Babalu, Rafael Feuds, and GOAT candidate Fedor Emelianenko. Upon returning to the UFC, Dan put on a 5-round war with Shogun Rua that is widely considered one of the greatest MMA fights of all time. Henderson was obviously facing an uphill battle against Jones, but it was the perfect time to make this fight and see if the old lion still had it in him to win the title. Then it happened. In the early morning of August 23rd, the UFC announced that UFC 151 was canceled. What followed was one of the strangest days in MMA history. With questions mounting, Dana White held a conference call stating that, for the first time in the history of the UFC, a champion had refused to face a short-notice replacement.
So this is probably one of my all-time lows as being president of the UFC over the last 11 years. For the first time in 11 years, we're going to cancel an event.
This would prove to be only the beginning of a tirade against Jon Jones and especially Greg Jackson, who Dana referred to as a sport killer.
Now, I literally just bumped into Greg Jackson the other day, and I was kind of joking around about some of the things he said. I'll tell you what, I'll go on the record saying, this guy is a fucking sport killer. Okay? This guy, I mean, this guy's from another planet. I've never even seen anything like it in my life.
The previous day, Dan Henderson had called Dana to tell him that he had suffered a knee injury during grappling practice. After flying to Vegas and being examined by UFC doctors, it was determined that Hendo had torn his MCL and the fight was off. In the following hours, the UFC scrambled to find a replacement. Several fighters like Lyoto Machida and Shogun Rua were offered the fight, but ultimately they turned it down due to the limited amount of time to prepare for a rematch with Jones. Finally, the fight was offered to 2-time middleweight challenger and gangster from Westland, Oregon, Chael, the P stands for short notice replacement, Sonnen. According to Dana, Sonnen not only accepted the fight, but offered to fly to Vegas that night.
To be totally honest with you guys, one guy did, not only when I called him did he say, I'll take the fight, he said, I'll fly to Las Vegas tonight and fight him. And that was Chael Sonnen. Chael Sonnen accepted the fight with Jon Jones, wanted the fight bad. So as of, 8, 9 o'clock last night, we had a fight.
The fight made some sense. Chael had recently announced a move to light heavyweight and had been feuding with Jon on Twitter in the weeks prior. He was also a big enough name that it might draw in a few more people than the Hendo fight in the end. But alas, it was not meant to be. Jon Jones spoke to his coaches, who advised him not to accept a short-notice fight with an opponent as potentially dangerous as Sonnen.
Yeah, how about this? How about he sits down? He called when he and I talked. He says, "I got to sit down and talk to my coaches." His coach Greg Jackson says, "There's no way you take this fight. This fight. You don't take this fight on 8 days' notice. It would be the biggest mistake of your entire career." Wow.
This led Dana to declare that UFC 151 will be remembered as the event Jon Jones and Greg Jackson murdered, in a rant that absolutely buried them.
He's been a champion that hasn't been very popular, and I don't think that this is going to do wonders for his popularity. As far as the relationship with us, me and Lorenzo are both disgusted. I don't know why a guy who is a world champion and considered by many one of the pound-for-pound best wouldn't fight anybody. You're either a fighter or you're not. Guy's a fucking weirdo, man. Are you kidding me? turning down a fight, saying if he turns down a fight with Chael Sonnen, it'd be the biggest mistake. I mean, if he takes a fight with Chael Sonnen, it'd be the biggest mistake of his entire career because he's not ready for that guy. Greg Jackson should never be interviewed by anybody ever again except for a psychiatrist.
Dana laid all of the blame on Jones and Jackson, accusing them of hurting the careers of everybody working on the pay-per-view and stealing money from the undercard fighters with his selfish decision.
Good for you, Jon Jones. You're rich and you got some money. You don't need to take this fight. But there's a bunch of guys on the undercard that this is how they feed their family. And this is how they make a living. And the UFC has spent shitloads of money to promote this fight. This is one of those selfish, disgusting, decisions that doesn't just affect you. You just affected, 16 other people's lives.
To cap off one of the weirdest days in UFC history, Jones was booked for 2 different fights at UFC 152, and strangely, neither were against Sonnen. First, he was scheduled to rematch Machida, but apparently the UFC jumped the gun and Lyoto changed his mind. Then he was officially booked against Vitor Belfort of all people. But we will get to that in a minute. As many things as you can blame Jon Jones for, it doesn't seem fair to put all of the blame for the UFC 151 debacle on him. Yes, the UFC likely never expected a champion to turn down a short-notice replacement, but the main reason the card fell apart was because it was very thin for a pay-per-view. Moreover, UFC 151 can be looked at as a symptom of a larger issue plaguing the UFC during this era, where they were spreading themselves thin to cover a ballooning number of events per year. As unprecedented as it was for Jones to pull out of the fight, it does make sense when you hear Greg Jackson explain why he advised Jon not to take the fight on essentially 3 days' notice.
It was actually 3 days' notice. It's not 8 days' notice. You don't train the last week of a fight camp. You know what I mean? That's what you do in Vegas, which is media and weight cutting, and there's no real training going on there. So it's 3 days' notice. I mean, let's be clear about that first. Second of all, I would say that, when I was asked if fighting Sonnen for the world title on 3 days' notice in a completely different style was a smart idea, I said no. I didn't know at that time that the entire card was riding on it, and that if one fight canceled, the entire card would cancel.
Beyond the uncertainty of trying to prepare for a new opponent on such short notice, Chael's involvement raised some eyebrows. Given the fact that he was training partners with Henderson, there were questions about Sonnen's role in the situation. These conspiracy theories were further bolstered when Henderson's striking coach revealed that Hendo had been injured 3 weeks before pulling out. His team had hoped that the injury would heal with a few weeks of rest, so they kept their situation completely under wraps. Hendo went so far as to pretend he was healthy when he met Dana White at a Strikeforce show only days before pulling out of the fight.
Dana, one thing, as far as Dan went, I mean, was this a thing where he was hurt like a few days ago and he was trying to gut it through and just couldn't, or is it just something that came up in the last day or two?
Yeah, well, I went to the Strikeforce fight on Saturday, talked to him, and everything was cool, and then he started trying to get in touch with me on Sunday. He didn't have my new number. He had my old number, and we didn't get in touch till Monday or Tuesday. I can't remember, but yeah.
When they eventually got Henderson through a workout, it was obvious that he wasn't ready to compete with Jones, and the decision was made to pull out. While Sonnen at first ran with the conspiracy theories, he would admit years later that he had no knowledge of Henderson's injury and was only starting drama with Jon because he had recently moved to 205. Jones himself would later apologize for the event being canceled by comparing himself to Jesus Christ. Quote, "Carrying the cross for my company's decision. If someone has to take the blame, I will accept full responsibility for the way UFC 151 was canceled. I want to sincerely apologize to all the other athletes/fans whose time and money was wasted. I feel terrible about the way that was handled." End quote. Reportedly, Jones was thinking about paying the undercard fighters out of his own pocket, but when fans and fighters alike blamed him for the cancellation of the event, he changed his mind. Dana White would eventually place some of the blame on Henderson for his failure to come forward with the injury when it actually happened, which could have potentially allowed the UFC to figure out a backup plan in case he could not compete, something the company now regularly does for crucial fights. That being said, he was still in a bitter verbal conflict with Jon Jones in the wake of UFC 151. Reflecting on the debacle during an interview with Ariel Helwani, Jones said that his experience with the UFC made him feel like a piece of meat.
I just thought I meant a lot more to him. I really did. And I thought we were like, I don't know, I didn't really look at him as like a boss or anything. I just looked at him as like a friend, a business partner. And I just thought I meant a lot to the UFC. And they made me feel like a piece of meat. like a total piece of meat, as if you totally, I just felt like a piece of meat, man. He just completely bashed me out, and my coach. It was just terrible, man. It was terrible.
Responding to these comments on the Jim Rome show, Dana White was quoted as saying, "I wonder how the piece of meat was feeling when we bought him the Bentley. I don't know. That statement right there drives me insane. A year and a half ago, nobody knew who Jon Jones was. Now the kid's a multimillionaire, and he's got this, that, a piece of meat. Let me tell you, I know some people who are in some jobs that feel like a piece of meat. Jon Jones is far from being one of them." End quote. The two continued sparring in the media right up to the night of UFC 152, with Jones claiming he didn't know that UFC 151 would be cancelled if he pulled out, and White firing back that the claim was false. The truth is, we will probably never know. Despite the weeks-long war of words, Jones and White were finally able to come to some kind of resolution right before UFC 152.
So, when I sat down with Jon Jones and we talked, I made a deal with Jon. So I'm not going to say anything about Fred Jackson.
The irony of the situation was that the main event of UFC 152 came very close to falling apart too. Vitor Belfort entered the fight with a broken hand and was allowed to fight despite failing a drug test for elevated testosterone levels, a fact that was only revealed 3 years later in 2015. I went over this controversy in more detail in my video about the TRT era, if you're interested. TRT Tord nearly became the first man to beat Jones when he locked up a very deep armbar in the first round. This was undoubtedly the most adversity that Jones had faced in a fight, but he was able to weather the storm, and in the fourth round submitted Belfort with an Americana. From the moment he took the title, we knew Jones could steamroll over people without resistance, but there had always been a question looming over him. What would happen if he got hurt, or if he was put in a bad position? Against Belfort, Jones proved that he wasn't simply going to wilt when he faced adversity. Nevertheless, there was a bigger story being told through the catastrophe that was UFC 151. It was the beginning of Jon's arc as a villain of the sport. When Jones took the belt in March of 2011, he looked like he had the potential to be that once-and-ever talent, a Michael Jordan or Tiger Woods of the sport. He was the darling of the MMA world for a while, and he had the UFC basically bending over backwards to turn him into a megastar. But slowly it was changing, and UFC 151 was the culmination of that change. In large part, that can be attributed to the way the UFC buried him for pulling out of the fight. Yeah, Dana did eventually admit that Henderson was partially to blame, but by that point the narrative was that Jon Jones was a coward who ran away from a middleweight. Even though they were able to mend fences to some degree, the relationship between Jon Jones and the UFC has remained fractured ever since. It has been estimated that the UFC lost at least $40 million by canceling UFC 151. So you can kind of understand why their dealings with Jones have never been quite as cozy as they once were. When looking at any of Jon's most recent conflicts with the company, you can easily draw a line back to this event. More importantly than his relationship with the UFC was Jon's relationship with the fans. UFC 151 was the moment when a lot of people who were on the fence about Jon finally turned on him. At this moment, Jon needed an opponent who would make him look like a hero again. And the best way to look like a hero is to take on a bad guy. As the title says, this is just part one of a series I'll be continuing over the next few months. As such, I was just laying out a foundation for some of the juicier details to come. And if you're at all familiar with Jones, I'm sure you know how truly juicy they will become. As always, I want to thank you for watching the video, as well as liking, commenting, and subscribing, and a special thank you to my supporters on Patreon who help make these videos possible. Thank you. Totally Not Ben Pixels, Fightback CBD, Ryan Cedor, Mike Roballs, Christopher Jackson, Big Raj Heh Homeless as Fuck Man Mans, Firebrand, Sneps, I Said No Cop, Paulo Gomez, Alex, Kyle, Hassan Jokai, Tambi Helmick, Neem, and Kevin Howard.